backstage that I almost didn't push live. But hi, I'm Jana. This is Café Jana, and I'm so happy to have Geoffrey on. Geoffrey and I have had the privilege of knowing each other for a very, very long time tangentially, and then we got to work together at HashiCorp for years, and that was really special. And Geoffrey's had just a pretty incredible career, and especially I think he's probably the best I've ever met in terms of building out and scaling educational programs, which I think are super important. So I'm really excited to have you here, and feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, Geoffrey Grosenbach, been working in tech and startups for about 20 years, started a video training program company for open source developers called PeepCode that a lot of people still know me about. Was involved in early Ruby on Rails, and currently Senior Director of Education at HashiCorp, building our certification programs and online documentation and tutorials.
Yeah. What else? You launched like the Learn platform, tutorials, workshops. You and your team do a lot.
Yeah, it's been great to start. I've been there 5 years and change, start a couple different projects, then got handed off to different departments. So I love, being a kind of multidisciplinary person, both myself and the team that I manage, but it's a level of success to start something well enough to then it can be handed off to other people. So initially we also managed like our worldwide training with training partners, but now that's a whole nother department. So, things grow and you specialize, and that's how it works.
Yeah, it is. I think that's like the beautiful part about working at a company through the different phases, but also I find sometimes a bit challenging too, where you're like, okay, you have to learn. It's like letting go of your Legos and adjusting, right? As budgets and headcount and resources and demands change, you just have to learn how to be flexible.
Exactly. Or it helps to clarify the things that you really do enjoy and love. Or if you can't do those professionally, then you get to do it recreationally. I loved when I was, running a video training company for open source developers and using a lot of video equipment and flying around doing interviews with people. And now that's not part of my day job at all. But hey, I go take photographs of my kids' sporting events or participate in sessions like this and find a way to involve it otherwise.
You also have probably one of the best voices for just like like I think your voice is, I mean, your face is pretty well known, but like your voice in particular is, there's like a soothing, there's a uniqueness to it that we all love.
Yeah, I never really noticed it because my uncle was a radio announcer for some period of time, and my grandfather has this really good voice, and I just thought, oh, it's the other people in the family, but I must have gotten some part of that too. And it is funny, it doesn't happen that much anymore, but occasionally I'd be at a conference or something and I in an elevator and I would just start a conversation with somebody and they would say, I know your voice, I've heard that before. So yeah, when doing podcasts and things like that, people knew my voice a lot more than my face.
So, I mean, we were talking before we jumped on that you started your career, right? In like 2001, 2002. Well, one, what was it like, starting your career during like the dot-com crash and a little bit like around that time? And then also, how'd you kind of transition into like education?
Yeah, I didn't have very good guidance in high school and was kind of I knew I wanted to go to college, but I just didn't have a lot of mentors or other people to talk to. Although I had the opportunity to take a couple of computer programming courses in late grade school and high school, but for some reason I just thought, oh, that's I can't make a career of that or something like that. And so roundabout ended up having an internship at a company and had an idea for a product that I could build with software. And by this time, I really barely knew anything about software, but I was able to put together just a little bit of a prototype. And the boss was like, this is great. Drop everything else that you're doing and go build that. And, it was literally like one day, on a Tuesday, I was doing some role. And on a Wednesday, it was like, all right, I'm a software developer now. And So I learned a lot from that. And the company continued to use the program that I started for years after, but they crashed and burned kind of in 2001, and another company bought their assets, and including the, some of that software and things like that. And so it was mostly just freelancing and working for startups for short periods of time for a little bit, until I decided, like, well, maybe I should take a shot at this. And so got involved in early Ruby on Rails, and that was such a fun time because lots of people were excited about this thing, and they but there was room for anybody who was going to blog about it. Or I joined in on like the official Rails podcast and just said, like, okay, let's just go interview some people and I can learn about this, and other people seem to be interested. And then it kind of took off from there.
Incredible. And then I mean, I always talk about education being such an important pillar for community building, and I'm curious, like what you found, right? So I think you started building out programs pretty early. Like there was a company that you built tutorials for, even though you didn't work for them, and you were surprised that they hadn't. Do you see kind of this role becoming more important at companies?
Yeah, why did I start with education? I guess it was, well, I was doing a podcast, and it was just interviews with people, and it was on technical subjects, but of course you're not going to read lines of code over the air or over audio, and that's not going to help people. And so I thought, well, what can I do that would actually and also, people weren't really making money on podcasts at that time, but I was putting a lot of time into it, and it was growing in popularity. I think, I had like 10,000 subscribers, and some individual interviews would have up to 100,000 downloads of people listening to this. So I thought, well, I should try to do something with this. And I thought, well, I'll just make a screencast, and I want it to be as action-packed and as useful to people as like a one-day instructor-led course. So I'm going to make it 1 hour, but there's going to be a lot of good content there. And hey, maybe somebody would pay $5 or $10 for these things. And it just took off, and people loved it. It helped to have an audience to start with already 10 to 100,000 people that I could advertise to, and it went on from there. But I was surprised when I got a couple of years into it, of thinking, like, okay, I'm making tutorials on Chef and this or that database, and Git, and all these different things. And some of those were commercial companies, even if they had open source projects. And I wondered, like, well, why am I doing this? Why isn't that something valuable to them? Because this is helping their business. And of course I was earning money from it too. But I love the fact that how much more important now, people recognize the value of developer relations, of developer advocates, of good online documentation. And, as we can see at HashiCorp, you can be talking to millions of people a month who come read documentation and can find what they need, and even thread that into the other kinds of training they need at a specific company. And so of course, HashiCorp, we teach about our own products, but yeah, it's been great to see the growth of that, and how companies really realize the value of education for developers.
How early do you think people should start thinking about it?
Well,
in the growth of a company.
Yeah, there's so many things with how we try to think about the things we can do, and it's easy just to focus on the things that are visually obvious or an immediate part of our experience. So it's easy to start and just think, like, okay, we should go around and do presentations at meetups or conferences, or have conference keynotes or talks at other people's conferences, and start out that way. But hey, even a successful conference talk, maybe you get a couple hundred people in the room, and a couple thousand people view a video afterwards when it's posted online or something like that. But if you have great documentation, if you have great tutorials, a good learning path for people to learn your product, well, hey, that can have a couple of years of life to it. And yes, you want early adopters who are going to find creative things to do with your product, even if it's not explicitly documented. But if you can just at least help them with their first 20 minutes or 30 minutes or even beyond from there, you can get a lot of out of it. So I think, I mean, if you've got a technical product, hopefully the first few employees you're hiring are also somewhat good at explaining that somehow. So you might not need full-time education staff right away, but I feel like within your first, couple dozen employees to have somebody who can think about that and publish that and contribute to it is a big part of growth.
Yeah. I always, I mean, they've done studies now, but it's like they always say that your documentation site is actually like your marketing site. And I don't know if you find as I'm actually really curious. So as like a developer, how do you like discover new tools? Like what's kind of your process or that you found?
It comes through all different channels. From early on Ruby on Rails, I think I found it because there were other people just in the general web community who were thinking about it or blogging about it. And there too, the documentation was a big part of it. Even from like some of the first releases, they didn't necessarily have end-to-end tutorials of like, okay, here's how you do this whole thing. But there was really good just API documentation, and every part of that framework had at least something. So that was one of the first things I did, was like, I just spent a whole day or a couple days just like reading the reference documentation end to end. And, for some people that would be boring, but it really made me appreciate how the different pieces fit together, realize that they were well documented and described, and then I could go on from there. So
they also had a pretty strong community. Like you were in like an IRC channel, but I feel like Ruby on Rails was like one of the first kind of like, at least I started in tech in 2008, around like the height of Ruby on Rails. And that to me is where kind of I learned like the foundations of community building. So I don't know, kind of like from your perspective as a developer, like what were some of the things you found apart from having great early documentation that made you want to be a part of it?
Yeah, I think, that it was a fun time to be part of that because Facebook was just barely starting. Certainly you had Slashdot and other kinds of things where people would interact on technical topics in different ways in comment threads or something like that. But, it was before Twitter and a bunch of this different stuff. And so it was a lot more just like one-on-one or IRC channels or even just mailing lists and things like that, where hopefully you would find people who were generous and kind and wanted to help you out with different things. And there was a lot of sense of satisfaction with that of, yes, there's this whole audience who wants to learn this. And if I get out there and spend an hour in an afternoon or evening or something, helping people with different questions that they have live just on IRC chat, then, that's actually going to help people. And that's where I met a lot of really incredible people right away that I'm still friends with. And I think it was a lot of that one-on-one connection that was really meaningful, rather than just like, okay, I'm going to have a YouTube channel and I've got hundreds of thousands of subscribers. That's fantastic. But it was more like those one-on-one interactions that kind of like really connect me in.
I think those are so important, where like, especially in the early days where you don't have to think about scaling programs, and those like high touch one-on-one, that handwritten note, that little like outreach thank you just goes like so much farther in the early days and really kind of helps cement that relationship or that connection.
And even now, you ask me like, how do I find out about new open source projects or things like that? I think a lot of it is just community and other people that I'm aware of. I know when I first got into Git, there were other people who were just kind of like on the cutting edge, and they thought it was this interesting thing. And I just had it in the back of my mind of like, well, someday I'll check this out and see what it's about. But it actually took a couple of years before lots of people seemed to think that this is a good way to go and we should learn this and use it for source code control. But now it is a lot of other communities. I follow a lot of other people that where I've learned a lot from their code. I do a lot now with like R stats and analytics, and I'm part of this sports analytics community called Sports Dataverse, and lots of people in some of these Discord channels and stuff like that that have done really interesting stuff, and maybe there's a visual element to it, or it's just an interesting approach or a data model or something like that. And so I'll go read their code, and then I see they're using this or that library or a certain technique, and you know, and then I can actually ask them about it if I need to. So that's been a great opportunity, is just go read other people's codes, see what kind of things they're working on either in their free time or professionally, and can be a real inspiration.
Yeah, word of mouth. Like that's the best way. And then I love being GitHub user number 26. Now that is that is, how did that happen? I mean, again, you were talking about using Git in the early days, but yeah, I mean, how did that happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to talk about this stuff without feeling like I'm just doing a bunch of name dropping or something like that. But you know, a bunch of these.
It's all right.
Yeah, the first person I uh, reached out to do this episode of the Ruby on Rails podcast was Toby Litka, now the CEO of, you know, founder of Shopify. And at that time, he had written this little blog engine, and it seemed interesting, so I thought I would go listen to it. I think that interview is actually like not very much online anymore, which is kind of good, because I was just like fumbling with the microphone and barely knew what to ask, and I'd done like a tiny amount of preparation, but that was about it. And
Oh, you mean I'll get better at this at some point? As I'm like trying to figure out how to use Restream, camera's not working, but you just go with it.
Exactly.
This gets easier. Good to know.
Yeah. So also part of that community was, yeah, Chris Wanstroth, who later founded GitHub, was doing interesting stuff with Chowhound recipe site, and some interesting scaling with Memcached and all these different approaches and stuff like that to handle the amount of traffic they had. And you know, I was doing this publishing of technical books and videos, and Scott Chacon was this really expert at just like the underlying data structures and things of Git. And so he wrote a whole book for me that was, you know, 100 pages or something like that. And we published that and sold 10,000 copies of that. And then I would like to believe that like that's part of what the other founders of GitHub looked at that and were like, this guy really knows what he's talking about. Let's have Scott Chacon, was basically the first employee of GitHub. So once they got that spun up, I just got this email one day of like, hey, we've got this project, you know, it's just hosted Git repos and stuff. Why don't you check it out? And so, you know, I signed up, and obviously we know where that went.
What was life like before GitHub?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think people don't remember is there were ways to host or share your code before that, but either it was really awkward, like SourceForge or something like that. You couldn't just like go sign up and start up a repo. You had this whole like approval process that would take a couple weeks or something. I didn't even remember the details. Or you could just host your own little kind of mini site that would show the code you had, and people would do that. But the fact that people could just learn this one interface, they knew they could go search for code, they could you know, collaborate in certain ways. That was the hard thing. If you were just hosting your own mini site that just kind of showed here's the files in this particular repo, well, then it's going to be hard to get teams organized around it and collaborate and things. So for GitHub to build that whole system out, but although like the pull request was a later development, you know, the first version, there were no pull request. It was just like, okay, here's my code, clone it or something.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess I assumed that was in the early days as well.
Yeah, if you go to the GitHub offices, they have the laptop where the pull request was invented, and
Was that Ryan Tomeko? I wonder who
Yeah,
that was.
Rage Maker, and I think it was his laptop, and I think it's like the enter key or the space or something actually has like a hole in the plastic because of like how aggressively he would type, and he like built the entire first couple versions of pull requests on that laptop.
Man. I love again, I've only been tech for 15 years, so not that long, but it's cool to see how like so much has evolved since then, right? To even think about days before GitHub and collaborating on code in that way. Yeah. Or I
Absolutely.
actually I had a breakfast with Armand, maybe it was like a month and a half ago, and we were chatting like when we launched Terraform. Um, like the download numbers were like not great the first couple years, but it was we had to educate a whole market on infrastructure as code. Like that wasn't so it's interesting to think about as people are launching open source projects and new ways of working, right? Like what it takes to kind of teach people a new category or a new way of working. So it's interesting to hear from Armand how he was like, yeah, for the first 2 years, Mitchell and Armand and I just had to give talks, just basic, what is infrastructure as code?
And I think that's impressive about how HashiCorp was started as a company, because Vagrant, that was the first product I used before HashiCorp was even a company. It was like, oh, this is great. I have a way that I can just kind of script my local disk images for VMs and doing development. I can have a couple different ones of these at once, and I don't have to worry about just like one environment for this database or however. And it was because Mitchell just went around to a bunch of conferences and meetups, and at that point, like, he wasn't even making money off of it, but he put in the effort to really spread the word and educate people how it worked, and get ideas out there on a technical level, and then it's continued on from there.
Incredible. And then I mean, it's interesting, right? Like I end up talking to a lot of founders, and I love that like the open source model is just kind of like the standard now, right? For how people are building businesses, the open core model. I guess I'm curious, a few things, right? Like how do you kind of stand out now, right? How do you kind of like there's so many open source projects, there's so many businesses. So like what are some ways, right, that people could kind of distinguish themselves or kind of stand out? I don't know, based on how you've seen businesses evolve over your career.
That's a good point, because you're right. At one point, it was a big deal that for a company to open source something, and there's a lot of work if you don't start with it open source at the beginning. Then, hey, you have to make sure you don't have any sensitive information in there, and that people can actually start the project, or create new parts of it without a whole bunch of effort. And so there's work at it. But now there's all kinds of open source projects out there. So just merely the fact that something is out there and it's open source isn't the same. Not to mention, you got the difference between like, okay, here's an open source project that I really want people to contribute to, and so I'm going to craft it in that way. Either that's like the core itself, or plugins, or things like that. And obviously, that's something that WordPress and Rails and jQuery and everything else have been super successful, is having a really like rich plugin ecosystem. Or it may just be like, okay, here's some code. I'm not necessarily trying to build a community around it, but here it is, and that communicates that my company, or me personally, that I have this ethos of open source. And like I was saying earlier, maybe people use it just for their own education. I go read it and I see how people organize code, or some interesting techniques or something like that. So I think you have to understand like which part of that is it. And then if you are a company that's trying to make money, are we doing open source because we think that's really going to grow like the ecosystem, all the people who are contributing to it? Or is it because we're trying to attract really skilled technical staff that we can hire, and we can hire developers? Or what's the goal around that? Because there are a lot of different roles. It's not just like, okay, it's free, you don't have to pay for it, end of story.
Yeah. I got into I was falling asleep the other night and I got into like a little LinkedIn debate with someone, as you do, right before you're falling asleep. And the debate was around like when you do have an open source version or of your product, right? And then you're building like a SaaS, and there's also a lot of times you end up competing with the open source version. And so this person was debating me. He's like, well, that was probably because you didn't have a well thought out business plan. And it's so, and I was like, how hard is it, right? When you are starting, when you're in the early days, right? Like, I mean, HashiCorp, we do in some ways compete with the open source versions of our tools, but that doesn't mean that we didn't have a well thought out business model. Our goal was to dominate in the open source, right? Capture the open source market and then figure out, right, later how to monetize and how to build enterprise versions. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we didn't have a well thought out. It just kind of happened. So, anyways, we were going back and forth on the nuances, but
Yeah, and I mean, every company has that problem. Yes, with websites, we can just push out a new version and people have to use the new version or, new version of a mobile app or something. But Microsoft, that was their problem for a long time, is that like people were happy with the previous operating system and, we'll just continue using Windows XP or something like that. And why should I upgrade, especially if I need to pay for a new copy of this? So it is, there's a case where open source can be that kind of competition, but it's a dilemma because you want something that's useful enough on its own as an open source product that people can find value in it and use it. I love the business model that HashiCorp has, which it gets more nuanced than this, but it's like, hey, you can use Terraform as much as you want for as many resources. You're never going to hit a point where it's like, oh, you've made 10, compute instances with Terraform. Please pay us for number 11. But we'll sell you, Terraform Cloud so you can collaborate. And if you're at that point where you need other people to collaborate together, then you probably have a business and you have enough, we're going to help you make money by using this and be more efficient as a team. And so then it's worth paying for. So you kind of have to, it's not just like the product just scales up and then it hits a point, now it's commercial. It's like, it needs to be a completely different flavor of it.
yeah. Ah, that's well said. Well, we're that was 30 minutes. I could talk to you forever. One, I miss you. I mean, I love that the last time we saw each other was literally in New York at NASDAQ at the HashiCorp IPO. So it's really great to see you again, and see you doing all the great stuff. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining this.
Thanks a lot.